Shalom Chavrim, and welcome to lesson 32 of learning biblical Hebrew. We carry on through Genesis chapter 2, God's creation of mankind we've just looked at, and now we'll see where God places the man in an ideal spot. Vayita Yahweh Elohim gan bereden mikedem vayasem sham et ha'adam Asher Yatzar. So this is Genesis chapter 2 verse 8 down to the word by word translation. And he planted, Yahweh God, garden, Bereden, in Eden. Here's the word Eden. Now, in English, we write Eden with an E because the sound at the beginning is lost. We don't have that sound in English. In fact, it was being lost in Hebrew by about Jesus' time, but it's still preserved in dialects of Arabic, where you get the real throaty sound made. So there we have it, Bereden, in Eden, Mikadem. So literally this is from east, Vayasem, and he placed or put Sham there, Eth ha'adam, object, the man, Asher, who, which or whom in this case, Yatzar, he formed. So, planted is the word for planted. God planted a garden. But interestingly, the Septuagint, which is the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, done in about 200 BC, translates gan as paradise, which is a Persian loanword that came into Hebrew, into Greek quite early on, yes, and also into later Hebrew. But here we just use the word gan, and here translated as paradise. So the picture seems to be of the Persian monarch's pleasure garden, where every blade of grass is neatly manicured and every leaf is trimmed and the park is beautifully laid out for the pleasure of the monarch. Incidentally, quite a different view of paradise to what the modern environmentalists have, which is that no one touches it, it's just left in its pristine state. This is the far opposite pole, in that every blade of grass and every leaf is carefully manicured by expert gardeners for the pleasure of the king. So a garden in Eden, and the word Eden is also sometimes translated in the Septuagint as delight. So sometimes the Septuagint translates this phrase as the paradise of delight. So it's very interesting here. God has just made the man, and now he places him in the ideal spot. Another interesting point, the NIV translates this here, instead of God planted a garden, it says the Lord God had planted a garden. English is very careful about indicating the time that things happen, but the NIV translation is motivated by a concern to harmonize this account with Genesis 1. But just from the grammar of the Hebrew itself, it's hard to justify. The action in verses 7 to 9 is all presented as sequential, following one after the other. The wa with imperfect verbs indicates that. So here's an interesting issue that occurs in other places as well. The translator can make choices which harmonize different passages that seem to contradict each other. But in my opinion, we need to resist the temptation to do that. We can usually only achieve partial harmonization anyway. But just there's the issue. Do we translate he planted or he had planted? Let's see what we wrote down here. We just wrote here planted, and Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he put the man he had made there. Now notice that the Hebrew says from the east, but we've translated in the east. It perhaps means from in the far east, but it could mean the eastern part of the place called Eden, or it could mean east of where the writer was, in other words, Israel. But there's perhaps symbolic significance in this too, because of course the east is where the sun rises, and so where light first appears, and light, as we know from the creation account in Genesis, is not just a physical thing that impinges on our retinas, on our eyes, but light has a spiritual significance which symbolizes and even embodies the goodness and the holiness, if you like, of God. So this garden is seen is placed in an ideal spot, and it's full of beautiful trees and plants and full of wonderful light. And there he placed the man whom he had formed. So there we see God creates the man, and then he creates for him the perfect environment, and he puts him there.